The royal palace of Sicily once rang with music, laughter, and the scent of orange blossoms drifting through mosaic-lined courtyards. But now, in the winter of 1194, it is a house of silence and dread. Deep within the fortress walls, in a candlelit chamber reeking of blood and sweat, a woman writhes in the agony of childbirth. Her screams echo off stone, but no one dares meet her eyes. This is no ordinary woman. She is Sibil of Aera, Queen Regent of Sicily, widow of King Tancred, and the last defense of a dying dynasty. Her sheets are soaked, her body trembling not just from the pain of labor, but from something far more terrifying: betrayal. Outside the door, armed guards stand motionless, their eyes locked in brief but chilling glances. They are not here to protect her. They are here to ensure that she does not survive. Because somewhere, perhaps in a whisper from a cloaked messenger or hidden in the ink of an imperial order, one truth has been sealed: this birth must not happen. The child in her womb represents a threat, a name, a claim, a future. And in medieval Sicily, a future was a weapon far more dangerous than any blade. No court physician comes to check her pulse. No priest is summoned to pray for the soul of the unborn. What should be a sacred moment, the arrival of life, is now the stage for something unholy: a murder planned to coincide with a birth. And here lies the horror that grips the viewer by the throat. This isn't the story of a queen who died in battle, or of a ruler executed by her enemies. No, this is the story of a woman strangled while giving birth, possibly by order of one of the most powerful emperors in Europe. A double death, carried out in the most vulnerable moment any human can experience. And worst of all, it was made to look natural. A quiet death, a covered-up crime. But if walls could speak, they would tell of hands tightening around a woman's throat as she screamed not just from labor, but from disbelief. They would speak of power, of fear, and of the day when even the act of giving life could not save a queen from being erased. This is the hidden history of Queen Sibil of Aera, and her final breath is where the story begins, before she wore a crown or ruled a kingdom. Sibil of Aera was little more than a footnote, a noblewoman born around 1165 in the rugged hills of southern Italy, where ambition was often drowned beneath the weight of lineage. History barely records her early years. She was not the daughter of kings, nor the centerpiece of dynastic prophecy. Yet, somehow, this overlooked woman would claw her way into the highest seat of power in one of the wealthiest kingdoms in medieval Europe. Her journey began not with trumpets or triumph, but with a marriage that, at the time, seemed politically unremarkable. She was wed to Tancred of Lecce, a man of charisma, yes, but also of illegitimate birth. He had royal blood, but only in the way a rumor has truth: technically, partially, and inconveniently. And yet, against every rule of aristocratic tradition, fate would bend for them both. When King William II of Sicily died without an heir in 1189, the crown should have passed to his aunt, Constance of Hauteville, a legitimate royal and wife to none other than the German Emperor Henry VI. But the Sicilian nobility, deeply wary of German domination, made a different choice. They rejected the empire's claim and crowned the outsider, instead Tancred the bastard. With that single act of rebellion, Sibil, a woman barely known beyond her family estates, was suddenly elevated to queen. It was a transformation so radical, it defied medieval expectations of female power. And she wasn't just a ceremonial wife standing beside a fragile monarch. She was sharp, observant, politically alert. She read rooms the way others read scripture. And soon, whispers around the palace began to shift from calling her a fortunate wife to calling her a force. Sibil adapted quickly to the cutthroat realities of court life. She was not bred for royalty, but she learned to rule. Chroniclers of the time describe her as decisive, perceptive, and unflinchingly loyal to Tancred's contested throne. In a court fractured by paranoia and ambition, Sibyl became the axis. She was the steel beneath the silk. And while the men around her plotted wars and treaties, she understood something far more dangerous. Thrones aren't protected by bloodlines, they're protected by strategy. This was not just the rise of a queen. It was the rise of a survivor in a world designed to forget women like her. But Sibyl would not be forgotten. Not yet. Her name had just begun to echo in the halls of history, and soon, it would shake an empire. But power gained through rebellion is rarely secure, and for Queen Sibyl and her husband Tancred, the crown was never a coronation. It was a countdown. The Kingdom of Sicily, despite its glittering facade of wealth and culture, sat on a fault line of dynastic tension. When King William II died in 1189 without an heir, he didn't just leave behind a throne, he left behind a vacuum. According to law and bloodline, the crown should have passed to his aunt, Constance of Hauteville, the last legitimate descendant of the Norman dynasty. But Constance wasn't just any noblewoman, she was married to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. If she became Queen of Sicily, it meant the kingdom would fall under German control. And for the fiercely independent Sicilian nobility, that was unthinkable. So they gambled. They chose a bastard over an empress. Tancred, with questionable lineage but local roots, was crowned king, and Sibyl, elevated by marriage, became queen. But every coronation bell echoed like a warning, because across the Alps, Constance and Henry were not watching, they were planning. They saw the coronation not as an obstacle, but as an insult. In their eyes, Tancred was a usurper, and Sibyl a glorified caretaker of stolen power. What followed was not just a conflict of inheritance, it was a clash of empires. On one side, a fragile, contested monarchy led by a bastard king and a politically savvy queen. On the other, a legitimate royal backed by the might of the Holy Roman Empire. And in the middle, Sicily, a crown surrounded by swords. As tensions escalated, the kingdom became a powder keg of paranoia. Every noble family had to choose loyalty to Tancred and Sibyl, or submission to the imperial claim. Every ambassador carried not just messages, but threats. And every feast or festival could erupt into a coup. For Sibyl, this wasn't just a political storm, it was a test of survival. She saw what others ignored. This wasn't a crisis that would end with treaties. It would end with fire, steel, and betrayal. And while her husband focused on fortifying borders, Sibyl focused on fortifying trust within court, within allies, and within herself. Because she knew in medieval politics, legitimacy isn't decided by birth. It's decided by who's still alive when the dust settles. And as that dust began to rise over Sicily, Sibyl stood at its center, unflinching, aware, and already preparing for the war no one dared name. In a world where women were expected to smile, bear heirs, and fade into the background, Sibyl of Aera refused to be ornamental. The Sicilian court expected a consort, but what they got was a commander in velvet. When the imperial threat escalated and Emperor Henry VI invaded Sicily in 1191, claiming the throne on behalf of his wife Constance, most eyes turned to Tancred. But it was Sibyl quietly, fiercely, who began to move the pieces. And the turning point came not with swords, but with silence. Constance, the legitimate heir and empress in waiting, was captured during the failed German invasion. The prize was unprecedented. The woman who could legally topple Tancred's rule was now a prisoner in Sibyl's hands. Many queens might have ordered the guards to stand down. Sibyl did the opposite. She personally took charge of Constance's captivity. But this wasn't about cruelty. It was about control. Chroniclers recount that Sibyl insisted they share meals. Chambers even sleep within arm's reach. To outsiders, it looked like diplomacy. But to insiders, it was clear Sibyl wasn't guarding a woman, she was disarming a weapon. She understood what her advisors didn't. Constance wasn't just a rival, she was a symbol. And symbols, if left unchecked, become movements. Sibyl's genius wasn't in grand speeches or military tactics, it was in anticipation. She thought like an enemy before the enemy struck, always 2 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. So when Pope Celestine III urged Tancred to release Constance as a gesture of goodwill, hoping to smooth tensions with the empire, Sibyl pushed back. Hard. She warned that letting Constance go was not diplomacy, it was suicide. And when no one listened, she said what no woman was expected to say. Better to execute her than to honor her. That line alone would cement her as either a villain or a visionary in the pages of history. But the king hesitated, the crown wavered, and the empire waited. As Sibyl feared, Constance was rescued on her journey back to Rome. She returned to Germany and to Henry VI with vengeance in her eyes. In that moment, Sibyl wasn't just right, she was prophetic. Her warning was ignored, and the cost would be catastrophic. Because in medieval politics, it's not the most noble who survive, it's the most prepared. And Sibyl had prepared for everything. Everything except betrayal from within. Then, as if history itself grew tired of waiting, the storm struck from within. In February of 1194, King Tancred, bastard-turned monarch, survivor of conquest, husband to a queen who outmaneuvered an empire, died unexpectedly. No battlefield glory, no long reign, just a sudden silence in the royal chamber. And with his death, the already cracked foundations of Sicilian power shattered overnight. His heir, William III, was barely a child too young to rule, too fragile to fight, and so, once again, Sicily placed its fate not in a sword, but in a woman's hands. Sibyl didn't mourn long. She couldn't. The crown passed, not just to her son, but to her. She became Queen Regent of Sicily, the lone guardian of a dying dynasty and an empire under siege. In a medieval world that feared female leadership as much as foreign invasion, this was not power. It was peril in disguise. She now bore the weight of 2 thrones, one for her son and one for herself. One symbolic, the other very real. With a baby in her womb and an infant king at her side, Sibyl was expected to smile for the nobles, reassure the church, command the court, and prepare for war, because everyone knew what was coming next. Emperor Henry VI, humiliated once, emboldened now by his wife's escape, was preparing to march again. But this time, there would be no missteps, no mercy, and no second chances. Sibyl was no longer playing chess. She was bracing for a flood. As enemy armies began swallowing Sicilian cities one by one, the Queen Regent stood at the edge of collapse. But she didn't flinch. She began negotiating terms not out of weakness, but strategy. Her offer was simple. Her son would abdicate the throne in exchange for keeping his father's ancestral lands in Lecce. Their lives would be spared, honor preserved, even in defeat. Or so she believed. On Christmas Day, 1194, Sibyl stood in the Grand Cathedral of Palermo and watched the unimaginable her rival Constance, once her prisoner, now being crowned Queen of Sicily beside Emperor Henry. What Sibyl had warned, what she had tried to prevent, had come to pass. And yet the most brutal chapter was still ahead. Because in the eyes of Henry VI, Sibyl's regency was not just a political threat, it was unfinished business. And unfinished business in medieval empires was always settled with chains or with silence. Sicily didn't fall with a scream, it fell with a promise, a false one. After months of relentless invasion, as German forces under Henry VI stormed through southern Italy like a tide of steel. Queen Sibil found herself at the center of a collapsing world. The cities that once swore loyalty to her family crumbled one by one. Their banners lowered, their gates opened. Her allies had vanished. Her army was outnumbered. Her kingdom was no longer a crown. It was a battlefield waiting to be claimed. And yet, amid the smoke of betrayal and the weight of pregnancy, Sibil did what no one else had the courage to do. She negotiated. Her terms were pragmatic. William III, her young son, would relinquish the throne in exchange for a lesser title, Count of Lecce, the land of his father's blood. In return, Sibil and her children would be spared, protected. It was not a victory, but it was survival. At least, it seemed that way. On December 25th, 1194, under cold cathedral arches and flickering candlelight, Sibil stood silent as Henry VI and Constance, her once prisoner, were crowned King and Queen of Sicily. It was a moment soaked in irony. The woman Sibil had once kept under lock and key now wore the crown Sibil had fought to preserve. To the nobles watching, it was just the closing of a chapter. But to Sibil, it was the final rewriting of her legacy. What followed next was not diplomacy, it was a trap. Days after the coronation, Henry VI shattered his own agreement. Sibil, her children, and her most loyal allies were arrested without warning. The woman who had bargained for peace was now branded a liability. Her son, the former king, was stripped of all titles. Her allies were executed or disappeared. Her brother, Richard of Aera, who had fought to defend Sicily from Henry's first invasion, was publicly hanged. A message written in rope. The Sicilian court had changed overnight from a stage of politics to a chamber of vengeance. For Sibil, there would be no exile, no quiet retirement in some countryside villa. There was no script for a queen who surrendered and lived, because to Henry VI, Sibil was more than a widow or a mother, she was a symbol. And symbols that outlive their kingdoms are always seen as threats. What began as a bargain for safety had become a sentence. And as the cell doors closed, the queen realized the truth. Her kingdom hadn't fallen in battle. It had been traded, betrayed, and buried alive. And then came the part of the story that even history itself seems to whisper in shame. Sibil, now stripped of her title, her kingdom, and her freedom, was taken north as a prisoner, no longer a queen, but a name on a list of conquered enemies. Yet she was not alone. She carried within her the last living remnant of the Tancred bloodline, an unborn child. In the cold and brutal silence of imperial custody, her pregnancy became more than a personal burden. It became a political threat, a future heir, a spark of legitimacy that could, one day, ignite rebellion. And in the twisted logic of medieval power, that possibility could not be allowed to survive. The exact details of what happened next remain obscured by centuries of rumor, revision, and fear. Some chronicles go silent, others speak in riddles. But one version has endured, passed down through whispers, preserved in the darker margins of Sicilian memory. It claims that sometime in late 1194 or early 1195, while in captivity, perhaps in transit to Germany, Sibil went into labor. It should have been the moment of life's triumph over tragedy. But instead, it became a sight of horror. Because as her body fought to bring a child into the world, imperial agents allegedly acted on a hidden order: the queen must not survive the birth, nor must the child. And so, in the most sacred, vulnerable, and agonizing moment a woman can endure, Sibil was strangled while giving birth. No sword, no public trial, just a pair of hands, tightening around her throat as she screamed in pain and confusion. The official record would later claim she died of complications in labor. but survivors whispered otherwise. Too convenient, too clean, too final. If true, it was not only a double murder, it was a desecration. A calculated act of political misogyny designed to silence a womb that still threatened an empire. And that's what makes this moment unforgettable, the grotesque symbolism. The act of creation and the act of annihilation happening in the same breath, in the same body, to a woman who had once ruled a kingdom. Even in the violent annals of medieval Europe, this stands apart. It wasn't just the end of a queen, it was the destruction of possibility itself. Because in that moment, Sibyl didn't just die, hope died with her. But even in death, Sibyl's punishment was not complete. The empire was not content with silencing her voice. It needed to erase her bloodline. Her children, once heirs to one of the most powerful Mediterranean thrones, were now reduced to bargaining chips, symbols of a defeated dynasty and targets for calculated cruelty. William III, her young son, had once worn a crown. Now he wore shackles. He was just a child, barely 10 years old, yet in the eyes of Henry VI, that made him more dangerous, not less. A living heir meant future rebellion. A lineage meant risk. So, according to several sources, the emperor issued a chilling command. The boy was to be castrated and blinded, a medieval method of erasing both manhood and monarchy in one brutal act. William died in prison just a few years later. In 1198, no throne, no legacy, no justice. The boy who had once been a king never saw his adolescence. His body, like his claim, was discarded. As for Sibyl's daughters, they were kept alive but in captivity, not out of mercy, but calculation. Girls were not considered threats in the same way boys were. They were political tools, pawns to be married off or displayed as tokens of imperial dominance. These young girls, royal by birth, grew up behind walls, their futures dictated by the whims of the very regime that had slaughtered their family. It wasn't until years later that Pope Innocent III intervened, demanding their release not because of justice, but because of leverage. Even their freedom was transactional, even their survival was conditional. And yet the poetic cruelty didn't end with the children. Henry VI himself, conqueror of Sicily, destroyer of dynasties, did not live long enough to enjoy his triumph. In 1197, barely 3 years after seizing the crown, he died of malaria in Messina at age 32. The man who had shattered Sibyl's world didn't get to build his own. Constance, the woman Sibyl once guarded like a prisoner, now ruled alone. But not for long. She too died just 1 year later in 1198, leaving her 3-year-old son, Frederick II, in the hands of the same church that had once ignored Sibyl's warnings. The irony was brutal. The victors were gone. The losers were buried. And all that remained was a shattered family tree, scattered across prisons, graves, and forgotten chapels, proof that in medieval politics, there are no survivors, only survivors for now. History doesn't always remember the loudest voices. Sometimes, it remembers the silence, the breath that was stolen, the future that never arrived. Queen Sibil of Aera left behind no monument, no published letters, no grand tomb. What she left was something far more haunting, a legacy carved into absence. Her story, once nearly erased by time, is now a mirror, a warning, a symbol of how power, when unchecked, doesn't just crush armies, it crushes women, it crushes mothers, and it crushes possibility. In her final moments, Sibyl embodied the cruel paradox of medieval monarchy, the woman who had fought so fiercely to preserve life, her son's throne, her child's birth, was executed for the very act of giving it. That is the horror that lingers. That is the reason her death still stings across centuries. Because Sibyl wasn't just killed, she was silenced in the moment she was most human. And that's the symbol that strikes modern viewers deepest. The act of childbirth, something sacred and universal, became the setting for political execution. Her body, once revered as queen, once feared as regent, was reduced to a vessel to be disposed of when it no longer served imperial strategy. And yet, in that erasure, she became immortal. Not in the way kings inscribe their names into stone, but in the way truth survives fire. Sibyl became the archetype of the woman history tried to forget and failed. For American audiences today, her story resonates in ways that feel disturbingly familiar. It's about the erasure of women in moments of power, the fragility of promises, the dangers of trusting systems built to favor dominance over dignity. It's a reminder that sometimes survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about being remembered. And for those who feel voiceless in a world of towering institutions, Sibyl's tragedy becomes a rallying cry that even in defeat, even in silence, truth leaves a mark. Her story teaches us something timeless, that power is fleeting, but principle is permanent. That warnings, even when ignored, hold value. That speaking hard truths, even when dismissed, is an act of resistance. And that those who fight for the vulnerable, even when they lose shape, the memory of what justice should have been. Sibyl of Aera may have died with her child, but her legacy lives on not as a footnote, but as a flame. A flame that dares to say this is what happens when we let power become cruelty and call it law. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you question what history chooses to remember, don't let it fade into silence. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you believe Queen Sibyl was murdered or erased by politics? Save this video so you can revisit the forgotten stories that still echo today. And if you want more dark, powerful tales like this, subscribe now. Your support helps bring hidden voices back to life. Because history isn't over. It's just been buried.